night of the 10th of May, 1941, the German Air Force launched the last great raid of the Blitz on London. When the Luftwaffe's bombers flew away, they left behind a series of raging fires which took days to put out. While bombs were raining down on London, a lone aircraft was flying across the North Sea, bound for Scotland. It crashed near Kilmarnock, 8 miles south of the city of Glasgow. Its pilot was quickly taken prisoner and, to the astonishment of his captors, was identified as the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich, Rudolf Hess. Hess had flown to Britain at a crucial moment in the war. In May 1941, Germany seemed triumphant. In North Africa, the brilliant Panzer General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had bundled the British Eighth Army out of Cyrenaica and was now laying siege to the port of Tobruk. On the other side of the Mediterranean, a German blitzkrieg had driven a British expeditionary force out of Greece. It had been evacuated to the island of Crete, where a German airborne invasion would inflict another defeat and force a second evacuation. At his headquarters in Rastenburg, set deep in the gloomy pine forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was putting the finishing touches to his boldest plan of all, the invasion of the Soviet Union. As soon as Germany had overrun France in the summer of 1940, Hitler had begun to look eastward. The stubborn British, driven out of France and now facing the threat of invasion, had nevertheless refused to come to terms with Hitler. Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was pledged to fight on. Hitler's peace feelers were rejected. In the Battle of Britain, the all-conquering Luftwaffe had received a mauling at the hands of the Royal Air Force's Fighter Command. Hitler had been forced to abandon his plans to invade southern England, but he still considered the British as good as beaten. He decided to finish off the Soviet Union before its armed forces became too strong. Hitler was confident of another quick victory. He told his generals, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come tumbling down." But British intelligence, which had cracked the military code enciphered on Germany's Enigma machines, was well aware of Hitler's plans. Without revealing the source of this information, the British provided the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, with a detailed picture of the German order of battle for Barbarossa, the code name which Hitler had given the invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin, who had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in August 1939, chose to disbelieve the British. It was at this moment, when over 1 million German troops were massing on Poland's border with Russia, that one of the leading figures in Nazi Germany took off on one of the most bizarre missions of the war. On the night of the 10th of May, 1941, the Me-110 flown by Rudolf Hess came to earth in a field in Scotland. The pilot, who had parachuted to safety, was quickly captured by the local Home Guard. He told his captors that he was Captain Alfred Horn, and he had papers on him in that name. He also insisted that he had a message of the greatest importance for the Duke of Hamilton, a serving officer in the Royal Air Force, whose family home at Dungavel was only a few miles away. If Hess had been planning to land there, he had come very close, but the Duke was not at home. That night he was in the operations room at a nearby RAF station. The farmer who was first on the scene later recalled his unexpected visitor.
He appeared to be a gentleman of good education. When I introduced him to my mother, he said he was married and pulled out a photograph of his little boy, of whom he was very proud. He said, "I have seen him this morning, but heaven knows when I shall see him again."
It was a pleasure to do anything for us gentlemen, although he was a Jerry. He was a gentleman, for he didn't sit down when I took him in, till I told him. And after all, he was somebody's son.
He was more than that. To several of his captors, the face of the German pilot seemed strangely familiar. They were right to be puzzled. The man in their hands was one of Adolf Hitler's oldest comrades. In the First World War, they had fought in the same regiment before Hess became a pilot. Hess had been at Hitler's side from the earliest days of the Nazi Party. He had taken part in Hitler's unsuccessful military coup in Munich in 1923. Afterwards, he had accompanied Hitler to Landsberg prison and helped him write Mein Kampf, the blueprint for the Führer's political career. Hess had introduced Hitler to the philosopher Karl Haushofer, who became one of the Nazi leader's intellectual mentors. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the faithful Hess received his reward. He was appointed Hitler's deputy. Hess had no great ability and owed his position to his dog-like devotion to the Führer.
In aller Form zur Welt bekräftigen, was euch längst Selbstverständlichkeit war. Ich schwöre Adolf Hitler.
Not only was he seen with Hitler on all party occasions, he also echoed everything Hitler said, believed totally in Hitler's genius, and accepted without question the Nazi creed. But by 1939, Hess had been elbowed aside by more ruthless colleagues like Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, leader of the dreaded SS, and Martin Bormann, Hitler's ever-present secretary. Hess remained fanatically loyal to Hitler, but his awkward, humorless manner and his obsession with fringe medicine and the outer reaches of Teutonic mysticism made him more of a figure of fun in Nazi circles than a man of influence. By the late 1930s, he had been relegated to the sidelines. Hess shared Hitler's unaffected admiration for the British Empire. The son of a German merchant, he had been born and brought up in Egypt. Like his leader, he saw the Soviet Union and communism as the real enemy. With the British now isolated, it seemed impossible that they could win the war. Hess was convinced that they should seek peace with Germany, keep their empire, and leave Hitler a free hand to crush communism. Each of Hitler's henchmen had his own personal intelligence apparatus. Hess's intelligence operatives were convinced that in Britain there was a powerful peace party ready to remove Churchill and come to terms with Germany. There was some truth in this. It's easy to forget that in the first 2 years of Churchill's premiership, his position was not wholly secure. The Battle of Britain had saved the nation from invasion, but offered few clues as to how Britain could defeat Germany by her own unaided efforts. There were influential figures who considered Churchill a warmonger, bent on placing the British Empire at risk in a futile fight against Germany. Among them was the former Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, an arch-appeaser of the 1930s who had been packed off to the United States as British ambassador. David Lloyd George, a former Prime Minister whose last spell in office had been in the early 1920s and who had visited Hitler in the 1930s. And Lord Beaverbrook, the newspaper baron who had served as Minister of Aircraft Production during the Battle of Britain. Apart from all being former somethings or other, these men shared a belief that Churchill was betraying Britain's imperial interests by refusing to reach an accommodation with Hitler. If they could not replace Churchill, they might be able to pack his cabinet with like-minded souls who would limit his freedom of action. Like Rudolf Hess, they considered that the Soviet Union, rather than Nazi Germany, was Britain's natural enemy. Before the war, this was a view which had been shared by many people. Those who sympathised with or joined Sir Oswald Mosley's Black Shirt movement, a British version of the Nazi Party, and rather more important figures like the former King Edward VIII, who, after his abdication, visited Germany as the Duke of Windsor. Hess's intelligence operatives believed that an important member of the Peace Party was the Duke of Hamilton, whom Hess had briefly met during the Berlin Olympics in 1936. Hamilton, a distinguished aviator, also met Goering at this time, and the corpulent Luftwaffe chief had told the British aristocrat that they had a common enemy in Bolshevism. Later, Hess convinced himself that Hamilton had sufficient influence to arrange a meeting between King George VI and a German envoy. The envoy to the king would be none other than Hess himself. In 1938, at the height of the crisis over Czechoslovakia, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had dramatically flown to Munich to prevent the outbreak of war with Germany. It was the first time that Chamberlain had flown in an aircraft. In contrast, Hess was an expert pilot. Since the summer of 1940, he had been contemplating an even more spectacular gesture. It would bring peace with Britain and restore his own waning prestige. Hitler had forbidden Hess to fly at the front, but from the autumn of 1940, he had begun a series of training flights on a specially modified Me-110. On the initial flights, he was accompanied by Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer. The aircraft was prepared for Hess by its designer, Dr. Willy Messerschmitt, against the express orders of Hermann Goering. In 1940, Hess approached Karl Haushofer's son, Albrecht, an official in the German Foreign Ministry. Albrecht had been a pre-war friend of the Duke of Hamilton. Could he write to Hamilton on Hess's behalf? The letter was sent via Lisbon and intercepted by British intelligence. They showed it to Hamilton and suggested that he fly to Lisbon to meet Haushofer. Hamilton agreed, but never went. At 5:45 on the evening of Saturday the 10th of May, Hess's Me-110 took off from an airfield near Augsburg. According to his own account, he crossed the Dutch coast without any problems from German air defences. Hess then dog-legged across the North Sea, feeling supremely lonely, before roaring across the British coast at a height of barely 50 feet. He finally bailed out 12 miles from Dungavel House. Later, he was to tell his captors that only his adjutant and secretary had any inkling of his plans. His wife knew nothing, nor did Hitler. After a puzzling delay, Hamilton identified Hess. Churchill's reaction was surprisingly casual. He went on watching a Marx Brothers movie. Hitler supposedly greeted the news of Hess's flight with one of his more spectacular tantrums. He vowed to have Hess shot if ever he returned to Germany. Hitler's propaganda chief, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, issued a statement in which Hess was painted as a deluded madman who had embarked on a lone and futile mission. Hess was moved to the Tower of London, the last prisoner ever to be held there. He told his interrogators that Germany would respect the integrity of the British Empire if Hitler had a free hand in Europe. He said there was no truth in the rumours that the Führer was about to invade Russia. Finally, Hess announced that Churchill would have to go. But it was Hess who went. First, he was taken under heavy escort to a country house near Aldershot, Mitchett Place, which was codenamed Camp Z. Then to a sanatorium in Wales. There was no meeting with the king. No negotiations were begun. Instead, Hess remained a prisoner for the rest of the war. In confinement, Hess's behaviour became increasingly bizarre. He accused his jailers of attempting to poison him and feed him mind-bending drugs. On several occasions, he tried to commit suicide. In Germany, Dr. Goebbels changed his tune. Hess was no longer portrayed as a lunatic, but as the victim of a British trap. Had Goebbels stumbled on the truth? A clue lies in London, in the so-called British double-cross system. This was a top-secret MI5 operation which controlled German spies who had been captured in Britain and turned. While apparently still at large, they fed their unsuspecting German masters a stream of misinformation devised by their British controllers. Simultaneously, juicy snippets were released through diplomatic channels in the neutral capitals of Madrid, Geneva, and Lisbon. Both sides were playing the diplomatic card. In these cities, espionage flourished, and the agents of the opposing powers could meet. The result was an intricate deception game in which each side probed the other's strengths and weaknesses. The British wanted to know the extent of the opposition to Hitler in Germany. The Germans wanted to discover whether Churchill could be ousted. The British probably got the better of the game, the essence of which is to confirm in the enemy's mind the picture he is already forming. Hess's intelligence men bought what they wanted to hear. An invasion of England was too risky, but Churchill could be removed. It is possible that Hamilton and Haushofer were players in this game. At the end of the war, Albrecht Haushofer was executed on the orders of SS chief Heinrich Himmler. There is intriguing, albeit circumstantial evidence that at the beginning of May 1941, the British expected someone to arrive from Germany. On the night of Hess's flight, Ernest Bevin, Churchill's Minister of Labour, told a trade union official, James Heal, that an industrial contact in Germany had informed him that Hess was on his way to Britain. Heal was sworn to secrecy and only broke the story in 1969. Who was Bevin's industrial contact in Germany? Could it have been Dr. Willy Messerschmitt? But what if the opposite were true, and Hess's flight was part of a deception plan devised by Hitler during the build-up to the invasion of the Soviet Union? Reinhard Heydrich was Hitler's security chief until his career was cut short by Czech resistance fighters in 1942. Like Hess, Heydrich was a pilot. According to Heydrich's biographer, Heydrich personally escorted Hess on the first leg of his flight over the North Sea before breaking off to report to Hitler at the Führer's headquarters at Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. Hess was known as a sworn enemy of communism and the most passionate advocate of an alliance with Britain. By sending him to Britain, Hitler might also have been sending a message to Stalin. Hitler knew that Hess's mission stood no chance of success. Hamilton had no political influence, and the chances of flying to find him at home were virtually non-existent. But the failure of Hess's mission might persuade Stalin to draw a comforting but wholly mistaken conclusion. With Britain still fighting, Hitler would not open a second front by invading the Soviet Union. Could Hess have been the unwitting but willing pawn in two separate but simultaneous deception plans? By appearing to play ball with Hess's overtures, the British were attempting to persuade Hitler eastward. Unable to defeat Germany single-handed, they were already angling to get the Americans into the war. They also needed the Soviet Union as an ally. At the same time, Hitler was attempting to convince Stalin that he was going to finish off the British before taking action against the Soviet Union. The third possibility is that Goebbels was right in the first place, and that Hess's flight was a lone act of a disappointed and deranged man determined to thrust himself back to the center of the world stage. Hitler's scheme, if such it was, came to nothing. On the 30th of April, 1945, he committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Allied soldiers combed the ruins for the Führer's remains. On the 7th of May, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The Third Reich had lasted not 1,000 years, but just 12. For Rudolf Hess, the war was not over. He was flown to the German city of Nuremberg on the 8th of October 1945, still wearing the blue Luftwaffe uniform in which he had arrived in Scotland. Here he joined 21 other leading Nazis charged with war crimes. Hess seemed to be suffering from total amnesia. He failed to recognize old colleagues like Goering. He remembered nothing about his flight to Scotland. He made a strange plea of not guilty.
Rudolf Hess.
Then, in open court, he made an astonishing announcement. He declared that he had faked his amnesia as a tactical move and would now respond to the outside world. He would now take full responsibility for everything he had done or signed. Then, equally dramatically, Rudolf Hess relapsed into his own private world, seemingly indifferent to all around him. The doors to his past were closed. Hess did not even bother to put on his headphones when he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was comforted by von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, who went to the gallows. Rudolf Hess spent the rest of his life in Spandau Prison in Berlin, moving in and out of the twilight world which he had inhabited since his imprisonment in Britain. By 1966, he was the sole inmate of Spandau. The British and Americans would have released him. But the Russians refused. Hess had now become a pawn in the Cold War. Over the next quarter century, neo-Nazis in the United States campaigned for his release. But from Hess, there was silence. There were more suicide attempts, and in 1977, a stroke which left him nearly blind. By 1984, Hess had entered his 90th year, a sickly, sad old man taking solitary walks in the garden of the prison. His death, on the 17th of August, 1987, was surrounded by as much mystery as the flight to Britain. He was found hanged, possibly by his own hand, or perhaps murdered in a small shed in the prison garden. 7 months after his death, Hess's remains were taken from their original secret burial site and reinterred beside his parents. The old airman's long flight was over. By the time he stood trial at Nuremberg, a fog of deception and misinformation had fallen over Rudolf Hess's remarkable flight to Britain. Had he been lured into a trap carefully laid for him by British intelligence? Hamilton's delay in identifying so strange a visitor, Churchill's insouciance on being told of his arrival, and Ernest Bevins' revelation to James Heal all indicate that Hess was expected. Equally intriguingly, how could Hess's preparations and the flight itself over a large part of Germany and occupied Europe have been concealed from Hitler? Would the fanatically loyal Deputy Führer have contemplated such a bold stroke without telling his leader? Perhaps the answer to these riddles will be found in the file on Hess kept in London's Public Record Office, but closed until the year 2017. Hess's headstone reads, "Ich had's gewagt." I had dared. He had dared, but not won.